Welcome to Sitting with Sallie. Today my guests are Gord LeMaistre, who is a Rotarian and the chair of the local polio awareness committee, Peter Harland, a retired pediatrician, and Susan Tooley, who is a polio survivor. Our topic today is poliomyelitis. When I first met Gord and he started talking about polio, I was thinking, why are we going to do a show on polio? It doesn't really exist anymore. But as you will learn, it really does exist. It's quite a significant disease. We will learn about it, its history, and where we are today with it. And I'll start with you, Peter, because you can tell us a little bit about polio.
Polio is caused by a virus, a very contagious virus, easily transmitted from one person to another. But it affects children more than adults, or rather children more severely than adults.
And I understand especially children under 5 years old.
Right. And it can lead to a number of very dangerous and difficult consequences.
And not everyone ends up with very serious. Sometimes the symptoms are similar to COVID, but other times they can be much more serious.
Right. In fact, about 74% of people won't even know that they've caught it. So they're asymptomatic. Another, say, 24% will have COVID-like symptoms, flu-like symptoms, headache, malaise, fevers, maybe some nausea and vomiting, but a little more severely than just irregular flu, and then gradually those symptoms will pass. There are more severe signs and symptoms of polio. It can then spread to, in a minority of people, to the meninges, causing meningitis, and even down the spinal cord. And that's when it becomes particularly dangerous.
And when it travels down the spinal cord, it can lead to some paralysis?
That's right. It hits the motor nerve cells in the spinal cord, spreads out to the muscles, and causes weakness, paralysis of those muscles.
And you said that it's contagious. Can you explain the difference between contagious and infectious?
They're much the same. It means that the virus is easily spread from one person to another. And it can be spread either by droplets, if you're very close to someone who coughs and sneezes, or it can be spread by the fecal-oral route, where contaminated water, which has become contaminated with town sewage, that sort of thing, then it can spread very easily that way.
Gord, I'm going to ask you a little bit about your Rotary's involvement in polio.
The eradication of polio is one of our longest standing and most significant efforts as a project. Along with our partners, we've immunized over 2.5 billion children in over 125 countries.
And that's since about 1988?
Yes. And we have reduced the number of cases by about 99.9%. This is one of the largest humanitarian efforts ever undertaken by a volunteer organization. 20 million children are walking today who otherwise wouldn't be because they're vaccinated. And this is because of the Rotary and our partners.
Okay. And I understand that the real focus is on vaccination. Vaccination is the key.
That is true.
Okay. And Peter, maybe you can tell us a bit about vaccinations.
Yes. Polio vaccines first appeared in the 1950s. The first vaccine was created by Jonas Salk in about 1953, and this became an inactivated or killed polio viral vaccine. So it has to be given by injection, which is quite inconvenient for a lot of reasons.
And it came out of because there'd been polio epidemics from the 1920s to the 1950s. And I think polio in Canada was called the crippler
Right.
at that time.
That's right. There were a number of epidemics through the 1800s and the early 1900s, the 1930s, but particularly into the early 1950s. There was a large epidemic which ran through North America.
And from that, the vaccination by Jonas Salk was developed.
That's correct. And shortly thereafter, a Frenchman, Sabin, developed an oral vaccine, which is an attenuated or weakened vaccine, which can be given by mouth, and therefore that makes it very much easier to deliver the vaccine.
And when you are saying attenuated, it's still a live virus.
It's still a live virus, but it has been weakened.
Okay. And then Gord, back to the 1950s, when polio was very much prevalent in Canada. I understand that they did a lot of things similar to COVID, closing, quarantine and closing places. And
Yes, that is correct. A lot of schools, playgrounds were closed in various places across the country, and people tried to avoid crowds, like going to a fair or a rec center or swimming pools.
And did they really understand where the polio came from?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if they really.
They just closed everything to.
Yeah.
I think people realized that it was a contagious disease, and you could pick it up by being in close proximity to somebody, or by drinking contaminated water.
Again, so just keeping crowds away.
Yes.
And Peter, do you know how many cases there were in the 50s?
How many cases there were?
Yeah, in the 50s or during its epidemic?
In Canada or North America at large?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
I was going
but
to
it
say
was a large number.
There were about 9,000 cases, I think, and about 500 deaths.
Okay.
So it really was, at the time, quite serious.
Right.
Yeah. And how did the epidemic end?
The epidemic ended with successful vaccination. And initially, it was the killed Salk vaccine, which was given to literally hundreds and thousands of people, and that killed off the epidemic.
And then when the Sabine vaccination came in, because it was oral, it was much easier to distribute.
That's correct. So it could be given to countries where giving an injection became more impractical.
You started practicing as a pediatrician around 1967. Did you see polio cases at that time?
I never saw any active polio cases. I only saw patients who had been affected by polio with a withered limb or weakness in a limb, or scoliosis, for instance.
And once you have polio and you have that weakness, it is with you for a lifetime.
It's a lifetime disorder, yes. And there's no specific treatment at the time that you get polio. It's not like a bacterial infection where you can give antibiotics. There are no antiviral medications which are effective against polio.
I think it's about time to bring you, Susan, into the conversation. Welcome.
Thank you.
You've been very patient here. As a young girl, you did develop polio.
Yes, I did. We always spent our summers on Coney Island, Lake of the Woods. And towards the end of August, I just didn't want to do anything. I just wanted to be left alone and to sleep. And my mother accused me of being lazy because it was time to close up and everything had to be put away and shutters had to be put on. But I was intending to go to school for second grade. And I started out on the first day. And at that time, we had to come home for lunch and then go back in the afternoon. So there were 4 good walks in between that time. I made it the first day, but the second day I just couldn't make it home. And my oldest and dearest friend, Lorraine, She tried to give me a piggyback and eventually left me on, I was on the curb on Yale Avenue, and I can still remember the house that I was sitting in front of. And she kept running and running, and then she would say, "I'm coming, I'm getting your mom, I'm coming back." It was quite a time. And then I saw Mom, and I said, "I can't move my legs." And at that point, I realized I could barely move my arms. And then it was a case of being with, our pediatrician was involved, and an orthopedic doctor was involved. And they agreed that hospitalization wouldn't be beneficial, wouldn't be as beneficial as being at home with, he knew my parents and my extended family, that I would be better taken care of. And they recommended using the Sister Kenny treatment. It was developed by a nun, I believe it was Australia, I'm not certain though. And moist heat that was given to the patient kept the muscles from atrophying. So
That was called Formants, I believe.
Foments, F-O-M-E-N-T.
And we're going to take a brief break right now, but when we come back, we'll hear more of Susan's story about using the Formants and how long it took her to recover from polio. Welcome back to Sitting with Sallie. We are talking about polio, and Susan is talking about her getting polio as a young child, around 7, I believe.
Yes,
And you were describing the formants?
Foments.
Foments, okay.
This nun, Sister Kenny, realized that moist heat would keep the muscles from atrophying. And so at 6 o'clock in the morning, my parents would come in with the foments, and I'd have them on each 4 on my legs and then 4 on my arms. And they were, I guess, rectangles of old wool blankets. And so that was put on, and then a rubber whatever was put on, and then a towel, and then a skirt pin. And I would go, okay. 6, 10, 2, 6, and 10.
They were pretty hot when they went on.
Yes, yeah. And it was every day until I started in September until about the end of April. In the meantime, I had a physiotherapist, and my mother was religious about doing the exercises because she saw the effect on herself. After 3 children, she was in great shape, but they were adamant that I would do that, and then again with the foments. And except for the scoliosis of the spine, I have little, if nothing, remaining from polio. I was very fortunate.
And so September to April,
Yeah.
you're basically in bed at home as a
Yeah.
7-year-old with these wet blankets wrapped around you.
Yeah.
How did you manage? Do you remember?
Well, I don't remember anything dreadful happened because my siblings were always there, and my grandmother and my friend Lorraine, she was a neighbor that lived down the street. And again, I don't know why I got it, because no one else got it. My summer friends on Coney Island that I would only see in January or July and August, none of them, I mean, we were all swimming together and sleeping together, and with sleepovers, and I just was the lucky one, I guess.
None of them got it, none of them got in your family.
No.
And Lorraine used to visit you quite a lot.
Oh yes, she still does. We've known each other for 77 years, and we decided that, at this point, we're still going to like each other, even if we argue a lot.
That happens. So in April, you went back to school, and how was that?
Oh, it was a relief. I know my mother was nervous. She didn't think that I could make it, but I'd been working at it very hard, and I've been keeping up with my homework and reading and all that. So I didn't really miss it that much. It was a relief to get downstairs.
Yes, to get back into the world
Right.
again. Yeah. And Peter, there's something called post-polio syndrome that does affect people who've had polio. Can you explain what it is?
This post-polio syndrome has become apparent some years later. And after the epidemic of the 1950s, people started noticing that polio patients around about the 1980s were starting to come forward with a number of vague complaints. So it now appears as though 30 to 40% of patients who've had polio develop some form of symptoms which are often poorly understood and maybe rather vague, such as malaise, aching, headaches, loss of energy, fatigue, and ultimately even some muscle atrophy and some weakening.
And what age does this usually come back if people are going to?
About 30 to 40 years after their acute bout of polio.
And I presume, again, there's no cure, just symptomatic treatment.
Symptomatic treatment, exactly.
And Susan, when we were talking before, you mentioned that you think your mother suffered from post-polio.
Yes, and for the longest time, her physicians didn't understand what was happening to her, but she knew, and she kind of persevered. I have a whole folder on all kinds of polio, post-polio symptoms. I know I've experienced them, and when it started, I just thought, I literally can remember the feeling, but I didn't have to stay in bed or anything like that, but it was the malaise, and it was the aching, and I was comfortable with it happening because I knew that I wasn't imagining it, it was really happening.
And you knew that because you talked to your mother about it, it happened
Yes,
to her too.
and when it was finally publicized that this was I guess a reflex of polio, that she wasn't imagining it all those years. I was going to say also that when I was, I think about 8 or 9, I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Jonas Salk at my friend Lisa Dupe's house. I don't know why he was there, and I know why I was there. And I asked him, and I said, do I have to still take the needles? I've already had polio. And I mean, a vivid recollection, he kind of crouched down, and he was a tall man. Of course, any man in a dark three-piece suit, it's kind of unnerving. And he looked at me and he said, the vaccine that we have developed will combat 16 strains of polio. And we have no idea how many more strains there are, but we're always developing more and improving the vaccine. You promised me that you will take all the vaccines. I said, yes, I will, I promise. But I think back on it, and that was quite an occasion that someone that was going to do something for anybody else that got polio was, in my estimation, pretty special.
Yes, and what an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get his autograph?
Yes, I did.
Oh, nice.
Wonderful.
Yes, we should
I did.
And I think what Susan is saying from Dr. Salk, Gord, goes back to what your emphasis is with the Rotary message, that vaccination is so important.
Exactly, yes.
And 1994, polio was eradicated in North America, I understand.
That's right, in North America and South America. And really, things got going with in 1988, when the World Health Assembly announced that they were going to passed a resolution to eradicate polio from the world. And this is the same year that the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was launched. And the 3 leading members were the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and Rotary were the key partners, but we also had a lot of help from many governments in the world and support of others. But the key thing is the Canadian government is one of the leading supporters of eradicating polio from the world and puts a lot of money into it.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and we're also a global leader in immunization, which is so important to eradicate this disease.
And during COVID, when a lot of things shut down, that must have affected a lot of not only polio vaccinations, but vaccinations in general.
That's for sure. Like Rotary had to pull back on all the vaccinations that they had a goal of 400 million a year to vaccinate that number of children, but they had to pull back during COVID. But since then, they've ramped up again and are back on track to get things going.
Say that again, how many a year?
We immunize over 400 million children under the age of 5 every year.
And that's astonishing. A huge effort. And where do you focus mostly now?
There's only 2 endemic countries in the world that report polio, and that is Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in 2023, Afghanistan reported 5 cases and Afghanistan 2.
Okay. And we're going to take another short break, and when you come back, we'll hear a bit more about how polio is still in the world. Welcome back to Sitting with Sallie. Today we are talking about polio, and my guests are Gord LeMaistre, who is a Rotarian and the chairman of the local polio awareness committee, Dr. Peter Harland, a retired pediatrician, and Susan Tooley, who survived polio and was telling us about her story as a young girl. Gord, you had mentioned earlier that Rotary's #1 goal is to eradicate polio. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about that and what Rotary has been involved with.
Okay, when you go back to 1988, that was when the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was launched. And the 3 key members were the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and Rotary. And at that time, we set up clinics all over the world to immunize children. And at that time, there was over 350,000 cases a year in 125 countries. Today, we've reduced that by 99.9%. And we're not going to stop until we finish the job and there's no polio cases left in the world.
I think you mentioned to me at one point that smallpox has been eradicated and that polio, we're almost there. We've got about, like you said, 0.1% left.
Yeah, smallpox is the only disease that's ever been eradicated through immunization, and polio is going to be the next one that will eradicate that disease through immunization. We only have less than 1% left to go. And we're working very hard to get that done. And immunization is the only way we're going to get there.
And that 1% is the really hard battle.
That's right.
And your past district governor, Dr. Pat Chernesky, was very committed to eradicating polio.
Yes, she was. Pat has mentioned. I think I'm stuck on that one.
Okay, well, 20, if I can help you out, 20 million children or people today are walking around because of Rotary's efforts, I think is what she said.
Right.
And again, fighting against that 1% is what Rotary is really all about.
Yes, the last 1% is like running a marathon. The last mile is the toughest. And in our journey to eradicate polio, we're into the last 1%, and it's going to be the toughest, but we are going to get the job done.
And you have things like COVID thrown up, and I remember during the COVID years, in Pakistan had a huge flood, which would have also affected people getting to the clinics to do vaccinations. Who helps with the funding for all this work?
The funding is Rotary and Friends of Rotaries are committed to raising $50 million US a year. This 50 million is matched by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation 3-to-1 to give a total of 150 million US going into polio eradication on an annual basis.
And you also mentioned that Canada is very involved in this too.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about the local efforts of your committee.
The local efforts, for the past 2 years, we've been holding a World Polio Day. And we have Rotarians and our members of our Interact Club take action to recognize, to create awareness of polio and to raise funds and to support the End Polio Now Fund so we can continue to immunize all the children in the world.
And I think the awareness is so important because, as I said, till we actually spoke, I had no idea polio was still in the world.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the key things that Rotary is involved in. We basically do three things. One is fundraising, but advocating to Rotarians and the general public in order to support the Rotary initiative.
And to make people aware of it,
Yeah.
and to try and get them involved.
Yeah. And Rotary is also really involved in the surveillance monitoring of both the wild polio virus and the circulating polio virus. Circulating polio virus it's so important to be able to identify those areas. So if there is an outbreak or something happens, they go in full force with immunization in order to stamp it out.
And I think I'll bring Peter back in because wild polio and circulating virus, can you explain a bit about those?
Yes. Wild polio indicates that in some countries, it is still endemic. It still trickles around and still hits people and areas from time to time. However, there's another form of polio which is derived from the oral attenuated viral vaccine. And what happens in some areas is that the oral drops are given to multiple children in an area, and it may not catch everybody. They may not be able to vaccinate everybody. And this oral attenuated virus can come back into the community because it's shed by children who've received the vaccine, and it can undergo certain changes.
It mutates.
To make it more powerful again. And I think it's estimated that it goes through, say, 3 to 4 or 5 changes, and it can then become a virulent form of polio again. So we saw this, for instance, even in New York, back in, I think, the early 2000s, where there was a student, a male person, who acquired polio from the vaccinated polio virus, oral virus, which had circulated through various people and had become more powerful with each change. So that is one of the risks.
And I think what we're going to do is have a second episode of Sitting with Sallie to talk about that, because that's very important, and talk a bit more about where polio is endemic. So I would like to thank you for being here today and providing very, very helpful information, and information that needs to get out there, as you know, Gord.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Thank
hope you will join us for our second episode where we talk about wild polio, about the attenuated polio, and I think Gord can bring us up to date on how the vaccinations are changing to be safe and more safely used. Thank you.